It's 1941. Things are looking pretty bad for the Allies. France, Poland, and most of Scandinavia has fallen under Hitler's advance. The British and the Soviets are weathering an inhuman assault by the Third Reich, and Imperial Japan, bloodlusted from its ravaging of China, is setting its sights on the United States. The fate of the entire world hangs in the balance, and right now the Axis powers seem to be on an unstoppable march to victory. The Allies need a superweapon, something that could turn the tide of the war decisively in their favor. Had the Americans yet learned how to split the atom? No. Had the Brits yet perfected the jet engine? Had the Soviets been able to field a fleet of aircraft carriers? Well, no and no. What the Allies did have, what the Americans in particular brought to the field of war, was a jeep. Although Churchill and Stalin undoubtedly seethed with frustration that this truck was all they could muster, the Americans were confident that the Willys MB could have an impact way beyond what was once thought possible. Could this plucky little jeep be the answer to the Allies' predicament? Could it somehow be capable of saving the entire world from Hitler and Hirohito's advance? Well, you're goddamn right it could, because this is the Willys MB, the OG combat vehicle that won World War II. The First World War was a wake-up call for every nation on Earth, a conflict that totally redefined the meaning of the word war. Far from the low-casualty, formation-oriented, cavaliering wars of the past, which had almost been looked at as a gentleman's sport by the nobility of many countries, the Great War was a lesson in hellfire and in agony. No longer were wars about posturing, decisive single battles, or proving one's honor. They were now total wars in which an individual soldier, no matter their rank, would be lucky to escape with their lives. Now, before we dive deeper into today's video, I just want to tell you that this video is sponsored by the fantastic people over at Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website and sell anything from products to content to time, all on your own terms. Now, let me share with you some fantastic features that Squarespace has to offer. First up is their Fluid Engine. With Fluid Engine, you start with a best-in-class website template, and then you use Fluid Engine to customize all of the design elements that you could want, and it's all very easy with drag and drop technology. Whether you're on desktop or mobile, it's a breeze. And let's not forget about Squarespace extensions. These tools allow you to connect your store to vetted third-party apps, expanding the functionality of your website. Plus, it's super easy to set up, saving you time, and it's not going to cause you a headache. Plus, the Squarespace email campaigns. With this feature, you can drive sales and engage your audience through regular email updates. Collect email subscribers, send welcome emails, announce upcoming sales, that sort of thing. Plus, they've got fantastic built-in analytics so you can see how effective your emails are. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/megaprojects and use the code megaprojects to save 10% off your first purchase. A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and now back to it. World War I had countless military advances: machine guns, grenades, modern artillery tactics, warplanes, tanks, submarines, chemical warfare, and the list does go on. But it also became a breeding ground for transport technology, especially early motorcycles, which proved to the world that a nimble, versatile motor vehicle could be a godsend on the battlefield. Before that, horses and pack animals were still doing all of the work to haul troops and supplies, so just having a mount that didn't need to be fed and rested was a major improvement. But motorcycles alone weren't enough to navigate muddy, unpaved roads or haul around any meaningful amount of equipment. The automobile, and specifically Henry Ford's Model T, was a far more intriguing option as a four-wheeled design allowed both higher payloads and better ability to move through harsh terrain. After the war ended, the US Army's Quartermaster Corps recommended that the Army invest in a lightweight, compact, four-wheel vehicle, but because of budget cuts, there wasn't much progress in choosing a design until the 1930s. By that time, the US and the world were getting a sneaking suspicion that there might just be another war coming. The Japanese, once considered to be a B-tier world power at best, were making major moves into mainland China, and an upstart anti-Semite with an odd mustache was vowing to build Germany back into a war-fighting empire. As the US saw it, the next conflict was going to make the Great War look like a backyard brawl, and other nations around the world were mechanizing their own militaries at an astonishing rate. Anticipating a potential market, some designers and engineers began working on a concept design for a US four-wheeler, which would wait in the wings until the army was ready to bid. The US Congress declared its World War I vehicles obsolete in 1935, which basically sent the Army back to draft horses until a suitable replacement could be found. First, the Army focused on prototypes for military trucks and gun-carrying armored cars, in a process that took several years. But it wasn't until 1940, when the war in Europe was already well underway, that the Army realized its need for a smaller, faster, and more agile off-roader. By now, the Army was getting a sinking feeling that it might enter the war unprepared, and since beggars can't be choosers, the Department of War reached out to no fewer than 135 US manufacturing companies in the hopes that just one of them could produce a design. They were to design a small, four-wheel drive, quarter-ton vehicle that could carry 3 troops, and they had to do it in record time. 11 days to provide a bid, 49 days to make a prototype, and 75 days to produce an initial run of 70 production line models. It probably shouldn't be a surprise on such short notice, but of the 135 companies that the Department of War approached, only 2 responded in time: American Bantam and Willys Overland. Since Willys was unsure it could keep up with the Department of War's timeline, American Bantam got the initial contract, and a design team formed between designers Harold Christ and Carl Probst, using early concepts that 2 other engineers, Preston Tucker and Harry Miller, had already been working on. Within 3 days, Bantam produced blueprints and cost estimates and got to work on a prototype. The truck they produced was an interesting concept, a 4-wheel drive powered by a Continental 1.8-litre 45-horsepower 4-cylinder engine. It had almost all the specifications the Army was looking for and delivered in record time. But by the time it arrived to the Army's testing site at Camp Holabird, Maryland, the Army had already decided that Bantam just wasn't going to cut it. The company had made a cool design, sure, but they had neither the production capacity nor the bank account to churn out enough models to fill the Army's needs. Instead, the Army pulled a bit of a double cross and sent Bantam's blueprints to both Ford and Willys Overland. Bantam really couldn't do much to stop this, and with the critical design work out of the way, Ford and Willys built their own prototypes. Bantam also submitted an amended version of their original design. Trial runs on the 3 prototypes saw Bantam again come out ahead, but again they were dropped by the Army because they couldn't produce 75 of the vehicles a day. Ford and Willys could, so both companies got to work. The Willys design was named the MA, or Military Model A, and the Ford design was named the GB. Under the Lend-Lease program, the first 1,500 or so Willys MAs that were produced were shipped off to the Soviet Union, while 4,500 Ford GPs went to the US Army. Now, that might have been an early indicator of where the Army ultimately wanted to grant a full contract, but it ended up actually being the nail in the Ford GP's coffin. The truck did its job okay, but the engine was weak and couldn't perform some of the more demanding tasks that it had to do. Not to mention the asking price for a Willys Overland Jeep, just $748.74 per unit, about $16,000 in today's money, was far too low to ignore. When it came time to standardize into one design, the Army went with the Willys and incorporated parts of the Bantam and Ford models in order to produce the final design. It was dubbed the Willys Military Model B, or the Willys MB. By October of 1941, both Willys and Ford were mass-producing the little truck, knowing all too well that a world war would wait for no one. The production line Willys MB, like a long line of US Army vehicles that came after it, was essentially a chassis built for easy modification. But before we get into the many variants of the MB, let's first have a look at the base vehicle. With a total mass of just under 1.25 tons, the MB was 11 feet long by just over 5 feet wide, with a clearance from the ground of about 9 inches, more than enough to move over most patches of mud and minor obstacles. The truck carried 3 to 4 crew members, depending on its configuration, with the option to mount 30 caliber or 50 caliber machine guns on a swivel post. The truck was powered by an inline 4 Willys engine nicknamed the Go Devil, which produced a net 54 horsepower. That horsepower gave it the ability to carry about 1,200 pounds of payload on-road or 800 pounds off-road with an operational range of 300 miles. Technically speaking, the MB could travel at about 65 miles an hour if it really had to, although this probably would have been a back-breaking experience for any troops unfortunate enough to be, sitting inside it. During World War II, Willys made over 350,000 of the vehicles, while Ford, using the Willys model, made another 280,000. With the Willys came other special equipment to fit its capabilities, including artillery trailers that can be seen in many pictures attached to their Jeeps, with both the Jeep and the trailer flying completely safely off the ground. When it arrived in hot zones around the world, the MB quickly earned praise from the troops who used it. Soldiers were especially taken by the power of its engine, which was far beyond anything they'd been given before. Other than the fact that the Willys could yeet an artillery piece at a moment's notice, it was praised for its versatility and reliability on the battlefield, and troops on both sides of the war quickly noticed just how damn hard it was to destroy one of these things. Although American and other Allied troops learned to resent so-called Jeep riders' disease, a cyst on the upper part caused by the hard shaking seats, the Jeeps were nonetheless prized by even the Nazis when they were captured in combat. During this time, there's no clear consensus on exactly how the term Jeep became synonymous with the Willys MB, but by the end of the war, the word was inescapable anywhere the Willys could be found. But then, there's all the myriad ways soldiers chose to modify their Willys to suit their purposes. In terms of armament, the MB showed up with anything from front-seat gun mounts to mortars, and the British, when they got their hands on some of the Jeeps, decided to strap twin Vickers-K machine guns onto the passenger side in order to charge into desert raids in Egypt. But far beyond the weaponry, the Willys could also be modified in many ways to suit the needs of battle. Willys produced modification kits to turn their Jeeps into ambulances, make them ready for desert or Arctic environments, use them to ford deep water or lay communication lines. They also made a Super Jeep version of their design with a significantly extended back section and a third axle to carry substantially more cargo. And versions of Jeeps that incorporated heavy armor, caterpillar tread, and even rotary wing gliders called the rotor buggy were tried out with various degrees of success. And finally, we've got to talk about the Seep, a seafaring variant of the Willys MB that was designed for amphibious use. Because the United States knew its war in the Pacific theater would involve a whole lot of island-to-island combat, it made good sense for the Army to invest into a vessel that could get troops from ships to shore, and even better, if that vessel could then be used as a vehicle on land. The answer, the Seep, turned out to be substantially heavier than was advisable to take on choppy water, making them likely to fill with water and sink. So after about 13,000 of the Seeps were built, they were deemed unfit for coastal operations with the United States. The Soviets, though, they had a much better use for the Seeps, and bought up the vast majority of them in order to help with crossing frozen rivers and lakes. After all, if a Seep broke through the ice, it would just float instead of sinking like a regular troop car. When the Willys MB arrived to World War II, it was through the Lend-Lease programs that the US shared with a number of other nations, with a cumulative 182,500 units going to various countries by the war's end. The British, the Australians, the French Resistance, and the Soviets were the largest customers overall, and it was actually units from these nations that took the MB into combat for the first time since it entered active service just before the US entered the war. But when America did finally get drawn into combat, the MB proved itself to be useful just about everywhere. On remote, thickly jungled islands, on the battlefields of Central and Western Europe, and on the barren sands of North Africa. Every branch of the US military received a stock of the Willys Jeeps, and they were deployed into every theater of war over the course of the conflict at such a high rate that Nazi troops began to believe that the Jeeps were standard issue for American servicemen. When the engines were on, the Jeeps were scout vehicles, beasts of burden, or light attack trucks. When the engines were off, they were holding sleeping soldiers, hosting a game of cards, or even being used to perform field surgery. The military police found ample use for them. They became a favorite among some of the more rough and tumble generals, and they were even capable of filling command and control roles during battles and skirmishes. They were plows, power plants, ambulances, even stoves to heat soldiers' rations. Many were equipped with special measures to deal with the sharp tripwires that German forces would lay at neck height over roads and trails, hoping to decapitate American GIs as they drove by. Others, particularly the ones used by the British Special Air Service, formed raiding parties that worked like modern-day cavalry brigades, performing hit-and-run attacks in the desert. The Willys were also a major part of the D-Day landings, which saw hundreds of thousands of Allied troops rush ashore in the first step to taking back continental Europe. Getting troops ashore in amphibious landers, gliders, and parachutes was an effort on a Herculean scale, but it was easy enough to figure out how they'd get to French soil. The same couldn't be said for tanks and armored trucks. Those would have to be offloaded at secure beachheads. But the Willys MB came in clutch yet again. They were small and light enough to fit into some of the Allies' largest gliders, and they were crucial in getting a foothold in Normandy, pushing back the 50,000 Germans that awaited them on the first days of the offensive. All in all, the MB's impact in World War II was nothing short of extraordinary. Here was a vehicle that could perform tasks no other vehicle of the time was able to do, a Jeep that could handle terrain and loads that would make perfect sense to people in today's world, but bordered on unbelievable in the 1940s. Although the MB was usually not sent intentionally into the front lines of combat, it was a tool that let the United States and the Allies adopt a completely different logistical approach than the Axis, and one that the Axis often struggled to understand. The power of the Willys MB was its ability to make Allied troops show up from angles and locations that should have been impossible, help them to hold out in zones that the Axis would have thought prohibitively hard to resupply, and extend the Allied military in, over, and around natural barriers that had historically defined when and where battles would take place. Like a truly revolutionary technology, it was hugely disruptive everywhere it went, and by winning countless tiny moments, it began to turn the tide of battles, and then turn the tide of war. General George Marshall called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, and it's tough to disagree. When the Axis powers were defeated in 1945, the MB received a hero's welcome back in the US, and Willys Overland capitalized on its popularity with a run of so-called CJs, civilian jeeps. These were the first four-wheel drive vehicles mass-produced for civilian use, and they were a hit with the masses. Much like the modern Humvee, countless surplus MBs were sold to civilians who often jumped at the chance to get their hands on one. A series of civilian follow-up designs would be sold in the coming years, and by 1950, Willys had secured a trademark for the label of Jeep. In the civilian world, the Jeep was the next generation of practical, everyman vehicle ownership after the Ford Model T, and international designs like the British Land Rover were strongly influenced by the Jeep's commercial success. In terms of its military service, the MB went on to serve alongside American servicemen in the Korean War and again in Vietnam. In both conflicts, the Jeep's unique talents stood out yet again, especially in navigating mudflats and hilly jungle terrain. It remained a favorite for quick, efficient ambulance operations and special operations troops for whom the Jeep's nimbleness and agility were a key advantage. Here too, Willys Overland used the many lessons learned from the MB to create follow-up models. The MC produced in 1950, the MD in 1952. Although those designs included notable improvements on the MB's design, the core vehicle went mostly unchanged and was designed to be modified just as extensively as the MB had been before. But after a few decades, and despite the sheer number available to the military, the MB began to be phased out. After all, its job could now be performed by its own direct descendants, and by the Vietnam War, new technologies like unibody construction and coil spring suspension made for a much more drivable vehicle. Over the 1970s, the last MB trickled out of military service. France, Yugoslavia, Japan, the Netherlands, and other countries that had taken to making MB knockoffs for their own militaries would eventually put an end to their service lives too. Surplus Jeeps left in the Philippines would eventually be converted to so-called jeepneys, which have become an iconic and enduring symbol of the country's post-war recovery even today. Around the world, the MB continues to be celebrated and praised, not least by Abu Dhabi's Sheikh Hamad bin Hamdan Al Nahyan, who built a 20-foot-tall, 4.5-ton, fully drivable replica version in 2010 because, well, for some reason. Even today, the legacy of the Willys MB rests on hallowed ground as one of the premier military and automotive innovations of all time. From international observers like Enzo Ferrari, who referred to the Jeep as America's only true sports car, to Ronald Reagan, who made later Jeep design synonymous with his presidency, the little ruthless car has earned more praise than nearly any other machine people have built, and yet every bit of that praise is deserved. As war correspondent Ernie Barr put it, it does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going.